Naval families never knew entire ghost convoys were lost at sea forever. They were told nothing, while ships slipped off the map and never came home. It begins in the gray North Atlantic, in a winter so cold that steel itself sounded different when it cracked. Families watched departure dates circled in red on kitchen calendars and trusted the schedules, the telegrams, the uniforms. A convoy leaves a British port under blackout. 70 merchant ships guarded by a thin ring of escorts, each hull carrying food, fuel, and men who believe they are part of something precise and controlled. But somewhere between departure and arrival, several of those ships will vanish without a trace. No flares, no wreckage officially recorded. During the Second World War, more than 100 Allied vessels were simply logged as missing without a confirmed last distress call. On paper, they become numbers. At home, they become empty chairs at the table. In one set of declassified files. A convoy remains listed as en route long after every realistic arrival date has passed. No official sinking, no confirmed sighting, only one final, strange radio message about lights on the horizon where no friendly ship should have been. The families were never told about that transmission, and no one ever explained what followed in the next 12 silent hours. Now the story will move through 5 deepening chapters, each one taking us closer to that silence and the questions that survived it. The convoy that never docked. Last photograph was taken at dawn, when the harbor lights were still glowing faintly against a sky the color of cold steel. A line of sailors stood along the rail of a merchant ship, their breaths rising in pale clouds, their faces half shadowed by the dim light. No one in that picture looks fearful. They look tired, focused, and convinced they are part of something routine, something understood. That photograph would later be pinned to the wall of a kitchen, where a wife traced every face with her thumb, memorizing expressions she would never see again. Convoy routes were meant to feel predictable. Families believed in the rhythm. Ships leave, ships arrive, letters return. But in that winter, the Atlantic did not behave like a route. It behaved like a boundary. Everything beyond the breakwater felt heavier, darker, and strangely distant, as if sound itself traveled slower. Ships cleared the harbor mouth under strict blackout, the sea swallowing them one by one until only their outlines remained silent. Obedient shapes slipping into the open water. At the port office, a last-minute routing order came through with no explanation. The path shifted slightly north, a minor change on paper, but every escort officer noticed. They always noticed. The new route cut through a sector known for unpredictable weather and radio shadows. Someone signed off on it anyway. Someone who never wrote a justification. In the control tower, one operator recalled a quiet moment when he watched the dots representing the convoy gather into formation on his plotting table. He remembered thinking they looked almost too tight, too disciplined for the sea conditions. But nothing in the manual told him to worry. These were merchant sailors used to risk, escorted by men trained to handle worse. And so he let the convoy move off the edge of his chart, vanishing into a gray expanse he had stared at so long it almost seemed familiar. Hours later, one ship radioed back a routine status report. Good speed, moderate swell, visibility falling. Nothing unusual, but the voice carried a tone the operator didn't like. He couldn't explain it. Something in the rhythm, a hitch between words, like the speaker was choosing not to say something else. He logged the message, glanced at the clock, and assumed fatigue. Back home, letters were already being written. A child drew a ship at the kitchen table while her mother folded laundry beside the stove. She had counted the days of this convoy on her calendar, marking the expected arrival in pencil. She would leave it there for months after that date passed. As the convoy pushed deeper into open ocean, the air changed. A heavy chill settled in, turning every metal surface damp. Winds shifted from the west without warning. Crests rose higher, slower, as though the sea itself was adjusting to something approaching from far beyond the horizon. Officers on the escort ship exchanged glances, but said nothing. They had seen strange weather before. They hadn't seen this exact pattern, but strange weather required no explanation. Near dusk, one of the merchant ships reported a faint echo on its primitive radar. It was probably a ghost return, a quirk of the machines when moisture built up. The captain dismissed it and kept formation. But the echo lingered. It blinked in and out, pacing them from a distance. The officer watching the screen leaned closer, tapping the glass as if clarity might settle the uncertainty. Then the echo vanished completely, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the ocean itself. The night that followed brought wind that rose in sudden bursts, pushing the ships into a slow, grinding swell that forced each captain to make micro-corrections. Steering in such conditions could separate a convoy by miles before anyone noticed. The lead escort signaled minor adjustments, reminding the ships to hold course and spacing. But the sea did not care about spacing, and each hull creaked under the strain. Hours passed with only the low hum of engines, and the occasional flash of white water against the bow. No alarms, no confirmed threats, just the slow tightening of nerves as visibility collapsed entirely. Officers monitored their compasses and clocks, trusting their instruments when their eyes could see nothing at all. Then something small shifted. A rhythm broke. A sound changed. A lookout leaned forward on the forecastle of an escort ship, squinting into a darkness so complete it felt physical. He thought he saw the faint outline of a merchant vessel slightly off its assigned position. When he blinked, the shape flickered, then dissolved back into the night. He reported it. Command acknowledged it calmly, but every man on the bridge felt something unsettled slip into the air. By the early hours of morning, the convoy should have remained stable. Instead, there was a growing sense quiet, unspoken that not everything in the formation was where it should be. A junior officer on one of the escorts later recalled the moment he realized he hadn't heard the distance from the ship that usually steamed off their starboard quarter. He paused, listening hard. The sound should have been there, but the sea offered nothing except wind and the deep rumble of their own engines. He considered reporting it. He didn't. Not yet. He needed a second moment of confirmation, something undeniable. That confirmation came minutes later as the ship pitched forward into a heavy swell. He glanced toward the horizon and saw a faint, flickering light too dim to identify, too steady to be lightning, too far from the known formation to belong to anyone they trusted. It glowed once, briefly, then went dark. He stood frozen, gripping the rail, waiting for something else to reveal itself. Nothing did. He reported the sighting. The captain listened without interrupting, then quietly ordered stricter radio discipline. No unnecessary transmissions. No speculation over the air dot in the convoy log. The sighting was recorded in a single line. Unidentified illumination observed. No location error noted. No follow-up recommended. On another ship, a signalman tried to send a routine message to confirm spacing. He tapped the key. Static answered. He tried again. More static. It felt wrong, not the usual interference, but a kind of static that carried weight, as though something large and distant was pressing against the frequency. He hesitated. Then he switched channels and tried once more. This time he reached someone, but the reply was clipped, hurried, and ended abruptly without the usual sign-off. The operator stared at the radio, wondering whether to classify it as an equipment fault. He decided to wait. Hours later, the morning check-in came due. One of the merchant ships did not respond. Then another. The escorts exchanged coded signals and adjusted formation, sweeping the dark horizon with searchlights they were not supposed to use. The beams cut across rolling seas and empty air, revealing nothing but spray and the pale shimmer of mist. 3 ships were missing from visual contact, but the logs would later show a quiet, eerie pattern. None of those ships sent a distress call. None sounded alarms. They simply drifted out of existence, leaving behind only questions the officers aboard the escorts did not dare voice. The lead escort prepared to turn back to search, but the weather thickened into a heavy fog that swallowed everything ahead of them. Crews moved cautiously, knowing that one wrong angle could split a hole. The sea groaned under them like something alive. A final message cracked through the static minutes before dawn. Lights seen drifting to port. Unknown origin. No ship claimed responsibility for that transmission, and no one ever traced which vessel sent it. After that, the radio went silent. New questions were forming. Old details no longer fit. And as the sun rose behind the fog, the convoy realized it had lost more than ships. It had lost certainty. Ahead lay the moment when the ocean would erase them completely. Echoes on the radio for hours after the convoy realized ships were missing. No one dared speak above a quiet murmur. The fog was thick enough to feel on the skin, clinging to eyebrows, uniforms, and the metal walls of the radio rooms. Every man aboard knew that sound traveled strangely in weather like this. Voice is bounced. Engines thumped in odd rhythms. The ocean itself felt closer, as if it were pressing in on them from all sides. Inside the escort ship's radio cabin, a single dim bulb swung gently with the movement of the sea. The operator sat with his hands hovering just above the dials, listening not for messages, but for patterns in the static. He kept replaying the last undocumented voice in his mind. The phrasing, the cadence, a breath caught mid-sentence. Someone had tried to speak through interference that wasn't entirely natural. He adjusted the frequency again. Nothing. Just a low rumble that seemed too steady for weather and too inconsistent for machinery. It almost felt like something pulsing beneath the ocean, a kind of rhythm he couldn't place. He leaned closer, closing his eyes, hoping for a single clear signal. All he heard was the sound of absence. Water slammed against the hull. Somewhere above him, boots thudded as officers began reorganizing the remaining ships. Their plan was simple: tighten the formation, reduce speed, maintain distance, and attempt to re-establish visual contact. But simple plans mean little when visibility disappears completely. On the bridge, the captain studied the faint glow of the compass, then glanced toward the darkness where the missing ship should have been. He muttered something under his breath, an old habit from a different posting years earlier, when a destroyer under his command vanished in heavy weather without a trace. He had never spoken about that loss, but tonight, those memories rose again in fragments. The late check-ins, the unsure bearings, the way the silence stretched on for days. He gripped the railing until his knuckles blanched. A lieutenant approached quietly, asking whether they should signal the rear escort for a coordinated search sweep. The captain hesitated longer than expected, not out of doubt, out of instinct. Something in his gut warned that breaking formation might scatter them further. He ordered a limited maneuver, nothing more. The lieutenant nodded and walked back across the slick deck. Wind howled through the narrow gaps in the superstructure, carrying with it a faint metallic whistle that made several sailors glance up. It didn't sound like the ship. It sounded like something brushing past them, then retreating into the fog. Far behind, one merchant ship reported hearing engines that didn't belong to anyone in the convoy. Slow, heavy, moving parallel to them. When the officer of the watch leaned out of the bridge windows, he saw only mist and shadows that might have been waves or might have been something else. He ordered his lookout to keep a double watch. Minutes passed. Then a faint sound drifted across the water, 3 short pulses, spaced far apart. Not Morse, not machinery, not anything the officer could identify. He felt a chill crawl between his shoulders. He reached for the lamp controls, ready to signal the escorts. But the sound faded before he could decide whether it was worth reporting. The convoy moved slowly forward. It was not progress so much as endurance. The fog lifted in patches, revealing fragments of gray sea and nothing more. Once, a sailor thought he saw a mast, broken and half submerged. But when they altered course toward it, the shape dissolved into the waves. Inside the escort ship's mess, nervous conversations whispered between men who pretended not to be afraid. One sailor ran his thumb along the edge of a metal cup and said he didn't like how the ocean smelled tonight, to sharp, almost chemical. Another insisted he felt vibration through the deck plates earlier. That didn't match their engine's timing. They argued quietly, the fear sitting between them like another unseen passenger. Back in the radio room, the operator finally caught something. A faint tapping, irregular, human, possibly. He leaned forward, heart racing. The tapping grew clearer, then vanished, then returned in a strange, uneven pattern. It didn't align with any known code. It sounded almost like someone pressing the transmit key repeatedly, as if fighting for control of it. He wrote down the pattern, though it made no sense. Then, abruptly, the tapping stopped. A single, distorted voice cut through the static. One word, a ship's name, a ship that was already missing. The operator froze. He waited for the voice to continue. It didn't. Instead, the static surged, filling the room with a hiss that made the hair on his arms rise. He called the bridge at once. The captain entered moments later, reading the transcript with a growing frown. He ordered an immediate triangulation attempt, but the signal was gone. Not faded, gone, as if it had been swallowed. The fog thickened again, turning the decks into slick corridors where figures moved like shadows. The crew felt a shift in the atmosphere, something almost electrical. A feeling that the convoy was being observed from somewhere just out of sight. Sailors stepped carefully, glancing into the mist, waiting for a shape to emerge, a hull, a light, a person. Then came the moment no one forgot. A signal flare burst in the distance, but it was the wrong color, and it came from a direction where no friendly ship should have been. Men rushed to the railings, scanning for movement. For a heartbeat, the fog glowed faintly with the dying light of the flare. Something large moved in that glow. Not a shape they recognized, not a vessel they expected, just a dark silhouette that slipped back into the mist before anyone could define its form. The captain barked orders. Engines roared. Searchlights swept wildly across the waves. The convoy tightened, every ship clinging to the escort like a lifeline. But the fog swallowed the light beams long before they reached whatever had released that flare. A new unease settled over the formation. Not fear of the enemy, fear of the unknown. Hours later, another radio operator, this time aboard a merchant ship, reported brief contact with something, transmitting on a distorted frequency. The voice was faint, cracking, drenched in static. Only fragments were clear, fragments of coordinates that didn't match any ship's position. Then the message broke into a long, low tone that sounded too steady to be accidental. The operator followed procedure and logged it, but he didn't send it up the chain. He couldn't. Something about that tone unsettled him deeply, as though the message was not meant for them at all. Wind picked up suddenly, pushing the sea into sharper crests. Hulls heaved and groaned. The convoy slowed further. Storm clouds built overhead, trapping every ship in a pocket of half-light. At the center of it all, the captain stood on the bridge, staring into the fog and feeling a growing conviction that they were moving toward something they didn't understand. He whispered to the lieutenant beside him that if another ship went missing, they would have no choice but to reverse course. That lieutenant nodded, though both men understood reversing might not change anything now. Then, as if responding to their unspoken decision, the radio erupted with a single tone, clear, loud, piercing. A tone no operator in the convoy had ever heard before. It rang through every speaker, every headset, every cabin. Men clamped hands over their ears. Officers shouted orders. The tone continued for 5 long, suffocating seconds. When it stopped, the sea felt impossibly quiet. Too quiet. A silence that seemed directionless and total. The captain turned slowly toward the navigator, who stared at the chart with pale, stunned eyes. The convoy was drifting off course. Not slightly, significantly, as if they had been turning without realizing it. The captain ordered all ships to correct. Engines rumbled. Rudders shifted. But the fog did not thin, and the silence held. Somewhere ahead of them, beyond what any man could see, a faint echo rolled across the water. Something large, something moving, something waiting. The convoy held its breath as they approached it. The night the ocean erased them, fog did not lift. It deepened, thickening into a damp wall that blurred the boundary between sea and sky. Even the ship's own bow disappeared into a pale gray haze that breathed in slow, drifting currents. Long after the strange tone faded from the radios, the men aboard the escort ship moved carefully, speaking in low voices as though the air itself might shatter if disturbed. The captain stood at the bridge windows with his coat collar raised, watching the compass swing against the damp. He did not trust the readings anymore. Nothing about their course felt anchored to reality. They were moving, yes, but toward what? Away from what? He had commanded convoys through storms, ice fields, U-boat ambushes, but nothing like this. A lookout approached him quietly. He reported hearing something ahead. Not engines, not waves, something slower, heavier, almost like a long, deep groan traveling through the fog. The captain asked him to repeat the direction. The lookout hesitated, then simply pointed forward, straight into the gray void. Moments later, the sonar operator called up from below. He described a large return, appearing briefly beneath their hull, too large for any ship in the convoy, too close to be natural, then disappearing without trace. The reading had lasted less than 2 seconds, but those 2 seconds spread unease through every deck. If something was moving below them, no one knew its size, its position, or its intent. The convoy slowed further. Engines dropped to a low, steady rumble that felt more like waiting than progress. Each ship clung to the other's positions with a desperation that bordered on superstition. No one wanted to drift. No one wanted to be the next to disappear. On one of the merchant vessels, an old freighter carrying canned supplies, a sailor stepped onto the starboard walkway to check the lashings. The fog swirled around him in dense pockets. He leaned over the railing, listening for the familiar thrum of another ship close by. Instead, he heard a faint, rhythmic tapping. At first he thought it was loose cargo shifting, but the sound came from outside the hull, something striking metal. Slowly, he leaned closer. A pale shape floated just beyond the reach of the walkway light. Not a life raft, not debris. It was the bow of another ship, silent, unmoving, drifting sideways in the fog like a dead thing. He shouted for the bridge. Officers rushed to the rail, but before they could identify which vessel it was, a swell lifted the fog like a curtain, and the ship was gone. Not sunk, not moving away. Gone, as if the ocean swallowed both shape and shadow in the same breath. They sent a frantic signal to the escorts. The message was confirmed. Searchlights swept across the fog, illuminating nothing but mist and white caps. The captain issued a rapid chain of commands to tighten the formation even more. Every ship in the convoy adjusted course, pulling closer, closing gaps that now felt terrifyingly wide. For a moment, tension eased. Remaining ships aligned, engines sensed. Lookouts scanned the gray veils around them with renewed focus. But then the wind shifted, and the fog pulled apart just enough to show something unimaginable. The convoy had drifted into a field of wreckage, barrels, splintered timber, a section of twisted railing. Some pieces bore fresh paint. Some pieces were still dripping with seawater. But no flares, no lifeboats, no survivors. A junior officer aboard the escort whispered that this debris hadn't existed on their course. An hour ago. The captain said nothing. His silence was answer enough. Men leaned over rails across the convoy, searching for identifiers. Every scrap was anonymous. Nothing bore a name. Nothing matched the missing ships. It didn't make sense. Wreckage should drift. It shouldn't appear in clean, quiet clusters exactly where the convoy now found itself. Suddenly, a loud crash shook the lead escort. Something struck the hull from below, hard. The ship lurched. Sailors grabbed railings, eyes wide. The impact didn't repeat, but the vibration pulsed through the deck plates long after the noise faded. The captain ordered depth charges, prepared not to attack anything, but to illuminate the waters beneath them. The crew readied them quietly, fearful of provoking something unknown. But before the captain gave the final order, the sonar operator called up again. He detected nothing. No movement, no echoes, no shapes. The ocean was empty, calm, still. The captain canceled the order. Better uncertainty than escalation. But the moment had already changed them. Every man aboard felt the same unwelcome truth. Something was nearby they could not see or predict. Hours slipped past. The night grew deeper. Wind strengthened. Rain began to fall in thin needles that stung faces and made decks slick. The convoy trudged forward through mounting waves. Engines groaned under strain. Officers checked compasses twice, then again. Navigation lights glowed faintly inside fog that swallowed their shine after only a few feet. On a merchant ship near the rear of the formation, the watch officer noticed a faint shadow pacing them on the port side. The shadow was longer than any ship he knew, a darker smear in the fog. He stared at it for nearly a full minute before daring to speak. When he finally called the bridge crew to look, the shadow had stopped moving entirely. It hung alongside them, silent and steady, as though matching their drift. A swell pushed closer. The fog cleared just enough to reveal a single detail. A railing, corroded, bent, old, too old for any wartime ship still sailing. The shadow slipped back into the fog before anyone else could register what it was. The watch officer stood trembling, unsure whether he had seen a derelict vessel, a phantom shape, or his own fear reflected back at him. Then came the moment that turned unease into dread. The convoy's rear escort sent a coded message, contact with 2 merchant ships established, followed by silence. Seconds later, the same message repeated, identical, word for word, with the same timing error in the code. The radio operator aboard the lead escort stared at the transmission sheet, realizing what the pattern meant. It wasn't a repeat. It wasn't confirmation. It was a recording and echo of a message already sent. But no allied ship had the ability to mimic transmissions like that, and the rear escort never sent the message again. They vanished from the radio entirely when the captain called for visual confirmation. The lookout swept the fog with binoculars. No shape, no light, no silhouette. The rear escort, a fully armed warship, was gone. Panic rippled through the convoy. Engines throttled up. Ships tightened formation until their wakes nearly overlapped. Men gripped railings, teeth clenched, waiting for the next disappearance. Rain intensified. Lightning flickered somewhere far beyond the fog. Thunder rolled like distant artillery. And then, a blinding flash of white light tore through the mist off their starboard side. Searchlights whipped toward it. Sailors shielded their eyes. The light glowed brilliantly for 2 seconds, then faded as quickly as it had appeared. But in that instant, for that fraction of a moment, they saw something terrifying through the thinning fog. The shape of a ship, massive, silent, motionless, resting low in the water as though half submerged. Its hull bore no name. Its windows were dark. Its decks were empty. And then the fog rolled back in and swallowed it completely. The captain stood frozen, heart pounding. He opened his mouth to speak, but a roar of wind drowned his voice. Another wave smashed against the bow. The convoy pushed blindly forward, forced by weather and fear. A final radio call cracked through the chaos. Not a transmission, a scream. Cut short mid-breath. Silence reclaimed the ocean. Fog closed around them like a tightening fist, and the convoy realized with a slow, creeping horror that they were no longer certain how many ships remained, or how many had already slipped beneath the surface without a trace. Paper over water morning should have brought clarity, but the light that finally filtered through the fog felt thin and unreal, as though the sun itself was hesitant to rise over the scene. The convoy, now reduced and shaken, drifted in a jagged line across gray water. Men who had been awake for nearly 20 hours stared into the mist with hollow eyes, unsure which ships still followed and which had silently vanished. On the lead escort, the captain leaned over the chart table, exhausted. He traced the convoy's projected path again, but the pencil marks no longer matched reality. They had drifted to far north, pushed by currents and fear, and now occupied a position that didn't belong to any planned route. The sea beneath them felt uncharted. A lieutenant entered quietly, carrying a stack of message logs. The captain looked up. The lieutenant hesitated before speaking, saying the logs from the night showed something odd. He spread them across the table. Time stamps were inconsistent, some repeated, others missing entirely as if transmissions had been swallowed and spat back in a different order. The captain tapped one entry and asked who wrote it. The lieutenant didn't answer, because no operator remembered writing that line. The entry described contact with a ship that was never part of their convoy, a ship no one had seen, a ship listed as sunk years earlier. The captain felt his throat tighten. He dismissed the lieutenant, but kept the logs, studying the handwriting. It was familiar, but faintly distorted, as though written by a tired man trying to imitate his own script. Just after midday, the fog thinned for the first time in hours, revealing broken sunlight on the waves. The sudden brightness made sailors blink as they scanned the horizon. A few ships that had been presumed missing came back into sight, emerging from the fog like survivors returning from a battle they never described. But they signaled no messages. Their decks looked strangely empty. Their flags hung limp. One escort tried to hail them, but no reply came. The silence was worse than any distress call. Still, the relative calm gave the captain a chance to radio command. He reported the disappearances, the unconfirmed positions, the strange transmissions. The static-heavy reply came minutes later. Maintain course. Avoid panic. Continue as planned. Continue as planned. The words felt detached, almost mechanical, as if spoken by someone who didn't grasp the situation or didn't want to. That afternoon, the weather shifted again. The sky darkened, not with fog this time, but with a wall of cloud building low and fast across the horizon. The wind carried the smell of rain, sharp and metallic. The sea changed color, turning a deep, unsettling blue. Even the gulls vanished. On the merchant ship closest to the lead escort, a young sailor folded a letter to his mother and tucked it into his jacket. He had written it in hurried handwriting, describing nothing of the strange night, but everything of how much he hoped to see home again. He glanced at the horizon, watching the darkness approach. He whispered that the ocean felt wrong, as if carrying secrets it wanted to share only when it was too late to escape them. The storm struck without warning. Rain hammered the decks. Waves rose like walls. Visibility dropped to near zero. The convoy struggled to hold formation. Ships tilted dangerously on heavy swells, their engines roaring as they fought to stay upright. More than once, officers shouted orders to avoid collision as vessels drifted too close. Through the chaos, the radio came alive again, bursts of static, half sentences. Voice is drowned by wind. One operator reported hearing a ship calling for help, but the message didn't match any known call sign. Another voice whispered coordinates in a foreign accent before breaking off into silence. During a brief lull, the captain tried to reach the rear of the convoy again. No answer. The storm swallowed his signal. It was then that the quartermaster noticed something ahead, something vast and unmoving in the water. He grabbed his binoculars, wiping rain from the lenses. What emerged through the glass made him recoil. A shape, a hull, huge. Wronged out, it looked like a ship, but its lines were crooked. Its bow listed too far to one side, half submerged. It had no lights, no crew, no markings. It sat on the surface like a ghost caught between sinking and refusing to die. The captain squinted through the rain. He recognized the design. It was a vessel reported sunk 2 years earlier, torpedoed, lost with all hands. Yet here it was floating in their path. Before they could alter course, another wave crashed across the deck. Men clung to railings. Lightning lit the derelict ship for a brief, harsh moment, and in that instant, they saw movement aboard it. Not figures, not people, something shifting deep inside the broken hull, as though the ship itself breathed. Then darkness returned. Rain swallowed the view. The captain ordered the convoy to veer starboard immediately. Engines strained. Rudders groaned. Wave after wave hammered the hull as they fought to steer clear. Behind them, one merchant vessel signaled distress. A massive swell had nearly capsized it. Men on the escort ship watched helplessly as the freighter disappeared behind the curtain of rain. They waited for it to reappear. It didn't. Not even a silhouette broke the darkness. Minutes later, another faint radio call cut through the storm. A voice repeating the same coordinates as before the phantom numbers. The operator slammed his fist on the table, shouting that it couldn't be real, that no ship could occupy those coordinates. The captain stared at him, knowing the truth they didn't say aloud. Those coordinates pointed directly beneath them. The storm pressed on for hours, blurring every sense of direction. By the time the weather eased, night had fallen again. The ocean felt exhausted, rolling in slow, heavy breaths. The captain walked out onto the bridge wing, gripping the cold metal rail. He searched the waterline for signs of the missing ships. Nothing. Not a flicker of light. Not a whisper of survival. Behind him, the navigator cleared his throat. He held a new message from command. A recall order. They were to abandon the search. They were to assume lost any ships no longer in sight. They were to proceed to destination as if nothing had happened. As if nothing had happened. The captain read the order twice, then folded the paper sharply. His jaw tightened. He didn't want to accept it, but the truth was impossible to ignore. Their convoy was broken, their losses growing, and the sea offered no explanation. Just before midnight, as the remaining ships crawled forward in uneasy formation, the lookout shouted from above. The captain ran to the window. Far ahead, barely visible through drifting mist, a single light blinked. A lighthouse? A ship? A flare? The light blinked again, slow, steady, almost deliberate. The captain raised his binoculars. Breath held. The light wasn't on the horizon. It was much closer. Too close. And it wasn't rising from a ship or a beacon. It was rising from the water itself. What the families were never allowed to ask at first. No one spoke. Every man on the bridge stared at the pale light rising from the water, a soft, pulsing glow that shifted beneath the waves like a heartbeat trapped below the surface. It flickered with a strange rhythm, to slow to be a flare, to control to be chance. The captain lowered his binoculars, breath shallow. The ocean around them was flat, almost still, as though waiting for someone to acknowledge what they were seeing. A sailor whispered that it looked like a lantern. Another insisted it was phosphorescence. The navigator murmured that the light was too uniform, too purposeful. Whatever the explanation, the pulse continued, growing brighter with every cycle. Then it began to move, not upward, forward. Approaching the convoy, the captain ordered the engines to half speed, keeping distance without breaking formation. His voice remained calm, but every sailor on the bridge felt the weight beneath the words. No one wanted to admit it aloud, but they all shared the same thought. The light was coming for them. Rainwater dripped from the rigging. The wind fell silent. Even the waves softened, leaving the sea unnervingly smooth. The convoy crept forward as the glow drifted along their starboard side, never rising high enough to reveal its source. It stayed just below the surface, illuminating the depths with a faint, unnatural radiance. On the nearest merchant ship, a young officer leaned out of the bridge window, trying to catch a clearer view. His lantern swung at his side with each roll of the deck. For a moment, he thought he saw the outline of a hull beneath the glow, long, curved, older than anything on the convoy. Something about the slope of it resembled ships from another era entirely, vessels that had vanished decades before these men were even born. But as soon as he leaned farther, the glow darkened instantly, as if aware of being observed. He recoiled, heart racing. The light returned a moment later, pulsing faintly once more, drifting past the convoy as quietly as it had arrived. No one could explain it. No one tried. By dawn, the light had vanished, leaving no trace. But something had changed in the men. Their fear shifted. It was no longer about the storm, or the fog, or even the missing ships. It was about the silence that followed the light, a silence thick enough to feel between thoughts. It clung to them as the remaining ships limped toward the thinning horizon. Every man knowing they were surviving the kind of night that would never be fully written down. When the convoy finally reached open sky, the mood should have lifted. Sunlight glimmered weakly through broken clouds. The fog dissolved into thin strands. The sea stretched clear for miles, yet the relief felt wrong. Too sudden, too clean, as though the ocean had simply decided to return them to the living, one by one. The damaged ships settled into formation again. Some raised flags, some signaled quietly, others remained eerily silent. On one freighter, the entire bridge crew seemed absent from view. When the escort attempted to signal them, no response came, but the ship remained upright and moving, its engines turning steadily toward port. The captain watched it for nearly an hour. He wondered whether anyone aboard was alive, or whether the ship itself was simply following the last orders of men who were no longer there. A strange tension followed the convoy all the way home. Port officials met them with confusion. Their arrival was days late, their formation incomplete, their signals inconsistent. Officers boarded the escorts first, asking questions about weather, damage, and enemy contact. They avoided asking about disappearances. They avoided asking why several ships had arrived without sending a single message. During the final stretch, the captain tried to explain what they had encountered. Every fragment of fog, the phantom transmissions, the derelict hull, the recorded message from the missing escort, the light rising from the deep. But the officials' eyes hardened with each detail. They took notes. They never asked for clarification. By the end of the meeting, they told the captain his logs were incomplete and required revision. Required revision, a phrase that meant something different during wartime. That night, clerks gathered the ship's logs, charts, and transmissions. Papers were stamped, redacted, filed, and taken away. Some were never returned. Others came back altered. Certain entries were suddenly missing, replaced by neat summaries that shifted the timeline of events or erased details entirely. Families waited outside the port office, clinging to hope as lists were posted on the board. Delayed, status unconfirmed, overdue, not lost, not sunk, not missing, overdue, a word that felt almost gentle, as though the ships would drift into harbor at any moment. One woman approached the captain directly. She held the last letter from her husband, asking whether the captain remembered seeing him on deck that final morning before departure. The captain said yes. His voice cracked slightly. She asked whether her husband's ship had sent any messages during the journey. The captain hesitated, then lied. He told her there had been no unusual communications. She looked relieved. She thanked him. He watched her walk away, letter trembling in her hand. He did not tell her that her husband's ship had been one of the first to vanish. He did not tell her there had been a cry for help without a ship attached to it, or that he heard her husband's name whispered through static long after that ship was gone. In another office, an officer questioned why so many details were missing from the revised logs. The response came coldly. Certain reports destabilized morale. Certain observations could not be verified. Certain losses needed to be recorded in a manner consistent with operational security. The sea had taken the ships, but paper would decide how they were remembered. Weeks later, a rumor spread among the surviving sailors. Someone claimed a diver had found fragments of a hull far from the posted lost coordinates. Another heard a story about a ship washed ashore with no crew aboard. None of these stories were confirmed. None were denied. The convoy survivors kept their own counsel. Some never spoke of that night again. Others whispered about the light beneath the water, wondering whether it belonged to something natural, something mechanical, or something they were never meant to understand. Years passed. Most records from that convoy remained sealed. Families searched archives, asked questions, wrote letters. Many died without receiving an answer. Their children continued the search, piecing together fragments from decades-old reports, trying to understand how ships could vanish without a trace and why no official ever dared explain. What happened in that fog dot? Some files were eventually released. Pages describing weather, supply lists, ship names, basic timelines. But the crucial hours of the night when the ocean erased them were missing entirely. Redacted, removed, covered over with the same phrase again and again. No significant events recorded. The surviving captain, now an old man, read those files in disbelief. He closed them slowly, realizing the truth he had long suspected. What the families were told was not what happened. What the reports described was not what the men endured. And what the ocean returned was not the whole story. Late one evening, the captain walked alone along the shoreline, staring at the dark water. He wondered how many ships lay out there with their secrets sealed forever. He wondered whether the light beneath the waves had been a warning, a guide, or something entirely beyond human understanding. He wondered what waited in the deep. Still watching, still silent, a faint glow flickered far offshore. barely visible through the dusk. He froze. It pulsed once, faded, returned. The old captain stepped closer to the water, breath trembling, because after all these years, the ocean was calling again.